En enero de 2012, el gobierno autónomo, conformado por el mayoritario Scottish National Party, anunció que el próximo otoño de 2014 los ciudadanos escoceses decidirán en referéndum si quieren o no la independencia respecto del Reino Unido. La fecha de la histórica consulta coincidirá con el 700 aniversario de la batalla de Blair a Lavonag, en la que las tropas de Robert Bruce derrotaron al ejército inglés de Eduardo II. La victoria conllevó la soberanía territorial del Reino de Escocia.
Liberal Democrats have always supported more powers for the Scottish Parliament, but we don't support independence because we want to be part of the United Kingdom family. We're internationalists, we want to share with others kind of risk and opportunity.
We'll take a very much an affirmative, a yes position in favour of independence based on the self-evident truth that countries do better when they control their own affairs and align all the resources of that country to get better and better results. So I think that's the basic proposition. We've been working on this for many years. 30, 40 years ago, people would say the only case for independence is an emotional one. Now we're able to say the only case for the Union is an emotional one. The case for independence is an economic, social, cultural, environmental one, and it's a case that is growing in strength.
We're here at the National Wallace Monument, and we are just outside the city of Stirling in the heart of Scotland. And the National Wallace Monument was a Victorian building, a tower or a monument or a memorial that was built to commemorate and to celebrate the life and the achievements of Sir William Wallace, Guardian of Scotland. And the reason it stands here on this hill, the Abbey Craig just outside Stirling, is that this was chosen because it overlooks the site of his most famous victory, the victory which Wallace had over the forces of King Edward at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, right back at the start of what is known as the Wars of Independence between Scotland and Great Britain.
En el año 1320, 51 nobles escoceses sellaron la Declaración de Arbroath. Escrita en forma de carta al Papa Juan XXII y datada el 6 de abril, el texto proclamó la independencia de Escocia al objeto de establecer tanto la existencia de esta nación como Estado independiente y soberano, como su derecho a defenderse con la fuerza en caso de ser atacado.
This was really the first facility of its type which was attracting visitors, and that pattern actually started the day when the foundation stone was laid. Over 100,000 people travelled from all parts of Scotland to be here on the day that the foundation stone was laid. And that was an indication of just the esteem, the high esteem in which William Wallace was held, the fact that he was held in such high regard throughout Scotland. And indeed, it was said at the time that the book about the life of Wallace was the second most popular book in Scotland, and it was found in every home. In fact, somebody once said that the two books you would find in every Scottish home, one was the Bible and one was the life of Wallace.
I guess when you look at other cases of this kind of movement, it's quite distinctive here, and in a way it's always been like that. Scotland, in the way it does its politics, has usually been about petitions, referendums, pressure groups, conventions, parties, all sorts of fairly orthodox political activities. It's hardly ever been involved in political violence. It's usually almost all been about elections, so it's got a very distinct sort of focus, and always has. And that looks quite odd when you compare it to other parts of the UK, the obvious case being Northern Ireland, and the way in which politics has been done there and in Ireland before it. So in that sense it makes it stand out. And of course, because of that, it means that sometimes it doesn't seem as if it's that strong or it's that passionate, because you don't see extreme activities. It all seems very modest and very moderate in what it tries to do. But that's a bit deceptive, because it is quite an intense phenomenon, particularly at the moment. Nationalism in Scotland tends to come in waves, and those waves you see in the 1950s, in the 1970s, and in the period that it is now. But it's not a very noisy nationalism. You know, if you want to hear noisy nationalism in Scotland, you go to sporting events and maybe sometimes party conferences. But amongst individuals, it's quite quiet.
Estamos en una situación en la cual no podríamos discutir la posibilidad de independencia sin el reconocimiento de la diferenciación histórica de Escocia, que desde la Unión ha tenido instituciones diferentes, por ejemplo, un sistema jurídico distinto, universidades distintas, educación distinta y naturalmente una cultura nacional distinta. Este es, bueno, el punto de partida, pero este no implica necesariamente la independencia. Hay una conjunción de momentos actuales que han cambiado la situación, yo creo. La devolución, por ejemplo, ha recreado el Parlamento después de 3 siglos de ausencia. Tenemos ahora un sistema político distinto. Hay al mismo tiempo una deslocación entre lo que se pasa a Londres y a Edimburgo. Por ejemplo, la política actual de la coalición a Londres es una política muy conservadora y en algún modo subraya la diferencia de valores entre, creo, la orientación hacia la comunidad, lo comunal en Escocia y el individualismo en Inglaterra. No es tendencial, no es una cosa absoluta, pero en este contexto implica algo. Y me parece que, bueno, la decisión sobre la independencia no sería una decisión basada sobre cultura, más sobre el pragmatismo económico.
Well, the constitutional change in Scotland has indeed been very peaceful, and the debate has also been very positive. This is a debate about the constitutional future of Scotland. We believe that Scotland is a nation, and nations are best served when they govern themselves. The fundamental reason for being independent is that Scotland is a nation, and nations are best served when they govern themselves. That's to say that the people who live in Scotland are the people best placed to take the decisions about our future. We've never had to resort to violence or anything like that. We can do it all through the democratic process. That's what's happening at the moment, and that's what I believe will carry us forwards to independence.
I think it's important for politicians to be involved in the political debate, but it's also important to respect what people actually think. I mean, we were against the referendum initially because we don't support independence, but the SNP managed to win a majority, so there's now a referendum, and we will respect the result, no matter what happens, and ultimately it's up to them. But we'll be part of the debate just like any other citizen.
El territorio escocés, con capital en Edimburgo, abarca una superficie de 78.772 kilómetros cuadrados, un tercio del total de Gran Bretaña, isla en la que también se ubican Gales e Inglaterra. La población escocesa ronda los 5 millones de habitantes, de los que el 40% viven en el área metropolitana de Glasgow. El hallazgo de petróleo en el Mar del Norte en 1970 sirvió para asentar la argumentación económica del movimiento independentista bajo el lema «Es petróleo de Escocia». Escocia cuenta asimismo con reservas de gas, una importante industria de energías renovables, mano de obra cualificada, nuevas tecnologías desarrolladas y la impronta de un 96% de pequeñas y medianas empresas que conforman su tejido productivo.
I think it's one of engagement. It's one of actually getting out and talking to them, and again getting them in the room and listening to them and explaining to them that the core problem that limits Scotland's potential is the lack of economic powers, because with a lack of economic powers we lose head offices, we have fewer jobs for skilled people, so we lose skilled people, we have less spend in research and development, there's less money recycled back into the Scottish economy, and we make a very simple point to the business community, and that is they, at the top of these companies call themselves chief executives because they control both sides of the profit and loss account and the balance sheet and are responsible for maximising their country, their business. What we've got here in managing Scotland is a government at the moment only spends the revenue, doesn't have that check and balance of spending to minimise expenditure, to maximise revenue, to strengthen the balance sheet. So we've made that point that if they want to have a really strong business, then a strong Scotland with the same powers that they have is a good basis to build their strong businesses.
Sometimes I think SNP nationalist supporters would do almost anything to get independence, no matter what the price, no matter what the cost. And there is a certain number of people in Scotland who believe that, and I think that's unhealthy. I think they should be looking at the greater good and what's in the interests of all citizens, not just their own individual political ideology. And that's what I was highlighting, but also the fact that we don't get very much detail from Alex Salmond and the Scottish nationalists. We don't really know what independence means. They don't tell us. That's why the presentation of their event 3 or 4 months ago was much ado about nothing, and I still stand by that.
Absolutely. I think the line is niche or be niche, follow your niche. We are Scotland, we're proud of it. We've got a strong brand. In fact, in the year 2000, Professor Michael Porter from Harvard, who's one of the top academics studying competitiveness and brand, told us that Scotland is one of the 16 countries in the world that has a brand that means something to 95% of the people on the planet. And that's because of whiskey and tartan and golf and our scenery, etc. But that mindset, that awareness is hugely important, because Scotland also has got a brand that's synonymous with integrity and reliability. So whether you're selling whiskey or a life insurance policy, that's a really important thing to leverage. And Scotland is not without friends. We have a great network of Scots abroad, and many people who feel an affinity with Scotland. Scotland, home of the Enlightenment in 1776, I think is possibly home of a second Enlightenment, where we build this increased autonomy with this increased awareness that we need to run a better planet, let alone Scotland as a better country.
El proyecto de los independentistas es sin duda un proyecto de crear un Estado separado del Estado británico. Exactamente lo que este implica es discutible, porque al mismo momento hay una discusión de compartir, digamos, servicios, quizá la defensa, quizá la regulación en algunos sectores de la economía, quizá la libra, sí, porque el euro no es muy atractivo en este momento. Bueno, es importante reconocer que concebir una separación absoluta sería muy difícil, porque tenemos lazos familiares en ambos países, en Inglaterra y en Escocia. Hay muchas familias que tienen lazos muy estrechos. Hay mucho movimiento, naturalmente. Según las ideas del señor Salmond, tendremos la monarquía en Escocia como en Inglaterra. Bueno, la reina sería la reina de los escoceses y también de los ingleses y de los galés, naturalmente. Pero en cada lugar sería una reina diferente, ¿no? Al mismo momento, hay un corriente que no quiere tornar al 16, el momento de la unión de las coronas, no el momento de la unión de los parlamentos, un siglo después. Todo me parece empieza a ser más abierto, porque hasta ahora la posición establecida de los nacionalistas fue que la monarquía sería compartida entre los dos países. Pero ahora los republicanos empiezan a lanzar el proyecto de una república, que también me parece tiene muchas implicaciones porque probablemente va a dramatizar más el proyecto de la separación. Con la constancia de la monarquía sería más sencilla.
Respecto al referéndum, quedan aún diversas cuestiones por definir y regular. La pregunta será clara y directa, del tipo, ¿está usted a favor de la independencia de Escocia? Pero el primer ministro escocés, Alex Salmond, ha mostrado asimismo su intención de añadir una segunda pregunta sobre la ampliación del poder del Parlamento escocés en materia fiscal. Tampoco están definidas las condiciones de reversibilidad o no del proceso, es decir, cuándo y cómo podría llevarse a cabo un proceso contrario al iniciado, de vuelta a la Unión, o por el contrario, si sería irreversible.
At the moment, the debate in Scotland is a bit of a false one. Most people are having a binary debate about independence, yes or no, when in actual fact, lots of the public in Scotland want more powers for the existing Parliament. So there's a third strand that's not really been discussed as much. And that's confusing in England as well. For politicians a little bit, but more so for the public to think, what are really the options here? And independence is a simple, straightforward one. It's an option, but it involves all sorts of problems, obstacles, things to negotiate. But people can understand what an independent country is. It's maybe a bit more difficult for them to understand what devolution is, because in England they don't have it. Devolution is much easier to explain to people in Northern Ireland or Wales, the Basque Country, Catalonia, those kind of countries. It's much easier to explain. They have an understanding of what it is, but in England they don't have it at all. So it's a bit of a problem for the public to tune into the popular option, if you like, that most people would support in Scotland.
I mean, we Liberal Democrats want to change our relationship with the United Kingdom. We believe in home rule so that the Scottish Parliament can raise in broad terms what it spends, so you're not dependent on a grant from Westminster, from London, that we can determine our own future right here. So I do hope it leads to further change, because that's exactly what we want. But I don't think it would automatically lead to independence, because I think most Scots want to stay in the United Kingdom, and that's certainly what we'll be arguing for.
The important thing for us to make clear to other young people in Scotland is that change is on the horizon. There is an amazing opportunity, and that is with Scottish independence. If Scotland becomes independent, when Scotland becomes independent, we will have the opportunity to make all decisions about all of Scotland in our own country. At the moment we have control over things like transport, education, health, justice. When we have the legislative competence to deal with these issues, it means that we can take decisions that are in the best interests of Scotland. At the moment, quite a lot of decisions, the most important decisions, are still taken in London. And I think that when those legislative areas come to Scotland, we'll be able to take the decisions that best affect the people of Scotland, because no one cares more about Scotland than the people who live here.
Sondeos como el de Ipsos, divulgado en diciembre de 2011 y realizado entre escoceses dispuestos a ir a las urnas, cifran en un 40% el apoyo a la independencia, porcentaje que en otros casos se eleva hasta el 45%. Tanto el trabajo como las decisiones que se tomen con carácter previo a la consulta serán determinantes. Por ejemplo, la juventud escocesa es mayoritariamente independentista. Consultas realizadas en los campus universitarios escoceses arrojan resultados de entre un 55 y un 70% favorable a la independencia.
I do think the results, the opinion polls have shown that there's not been any increase in support for independence in recent years, and it's around about a third of the population support consistently independence. But there was one opinion poll that showed that 6 out of 10 people would vote for independence if they believed that they were going to be £500 a year better off each. So that shows you potentially how close it is between winning and losing.
So you can look into polls, that's entirely up to you, but the poll that we're really interested in is the referendum, And the feedback that we're getting on the doorsteps and speaking to young people is that they are very much looking forward to voting yes. I think that young people in Scotland especially respond well to the positive vision that the Yes campaign has. They're responding to that message of hope and of ambition. That's what we are offering during this great debate about Scotland's future, and that's why I think so many young people are responding well to that message. Young people have the opportunity to take Scotland forward, an opportunity for Scotland to stand on its own 2 feet and be a world player, an opportunity for Scotland to have its say at the top table in the UN, a say in the European Union, and that's why I believe young people are very much in favour of independence and will vote yes for Scotland to become independent. We'll speak to everybody during this campaign, people who are against independence, people who are in favour of independence, and crucially people who are undecided about independence, because the polls apparently do show that there are around about 30% of people who are not sure yet. So it will be our job to go and tap on their door, to deliver leaflets, to engage with them through Facebook and Twitter, and explain to them the positive benefits of Scotland becoming a normal independent nation. So we've got 2 years to speak to hundreds of thousands of young people, but it's an opportunity that we relish. Well, I think there are 2 reasons. Votes at 16 for me is a fundamental point of principle. I would support votes at 16 for someone who will be voting no in the referendum. Votes at 16 is fair, socially just, and the right thing to do. If you're old enough to pay tax, to get married and join the army, then you should be old enough to vote for the government that sends you into war. It is a point of principle. Votes at 16 is the right thing to do, not just for the referendum, but for general elections as well.
La única lengua celta que todavía se conserva en Alba, Escocia en gaélico escocés, es precisamente esta, que llegó alrededor del siglo V sustituyendo a la antigua lengua de los pictos, una confederación de tribus que habitaron el norte y centro de Escocia desde tiempos del Imperio Romano hasta el siglo X. Pese a ser idioma cooficial, el gaélico es hablado por unas 60.000 personas en las regiones norteñas, el 1% de la población total. Las lenguas mayoritarias son el escocés y el inglés de Escocia.
I suppose all those things about language and institutions and history, they all play into a sense of a separate identity in Scotland that's been around since 1707. But it's only really become politically manifest in an obvious way, probably from the 50s and 60s onwards, where it feeds into politics much more directly. And they're kind of background factors. If you removed some of these things from Scotland, it wouldn't be Scotland anymore. You'd be taking away some of the raw material that the nationalism is based around. But when I say that, Gaelic is spoken by maybe 60,000 people out of over 5 million. So it's not there as a big issue that people will experience in their daily lives. They'll see signs in Gaelic, they may see forums, they may see TV programmes, but it's not really at the forefront. But then when they listen to music, there's lots of it there. They can hear it all the time. When you go mountain climbing in Scotland, loads of the mountains are named in Gaelic. So it's kind of there in that background issue for a lot of people, but it's not really central. But it tells you how difficult it is to figure out what the nationalism is here, because one of the big things you'd pick as a marker, language, doesn't really work with Gaelic. It maybe works more with Scots and people speaking Scots rather than English.
Buena parte del deporte que se practica en Escocia guarda estrechos lazos con la identidad nacional. El más popular es el fútbol. De hecho, la Copa de Escocia es el campeonato más antiguo del mundo. Sus equipos más representativos, el Celtic Football Club y el Rangers Football Club. La selección de fútbol escocesa disputa oficialmente competiciones internacionales. La selección nacional de rugby de Escocia, que disputa sus partidos como local en el estadio de Murrayfield, participa en el torneo de las 6 naciones desde su fundación y lo ha ganado en 14 ocasiones. St Andrews, en el condado de Fife, es internacionalmente conocido como la cuna del golf, y los Highland Games, Juegos de Montaña, son específicamente distintivos de la identidad nacional.
As I say, probably go back to the old farming days, the ploughmen and that, trying their strength to see who could lift the most or throw the most for distance. I would think, being a farmer myself in the past, the future, I think it will still go on the same as any other sport, like your Olympics and it's just a more of a traditional Scottish thing instead of like the Olympics, which is national.
Do you think Highland Games has something to do with the Scottish identity? Yeah, definitely, definitely. If you look around, everyone's got a different tartan on, lots of different colours, and testing each other's strength against each other. I think Highland Games should be televised on TV. So, like football matches, rugby matches, I think they should come and film the Highland Games. That would kind of up the profile. Scotland has its own identity, but with the independence, it really would be a country on its own.
Desde el tradicional clasa o arpa celta hasta grupos de rock independiente, entre la solemnidad de la gaita de los Highland y la aportación a la música country estadounidense a partir de la poesía de Robert Burns y hasta el realismo social de la novela Trainspotting, la cultura escocesa ha sabido buscar nuevas fuentes y formas con el paso del tiempo. El Reino de Escocia fue un estado independiente hasta el año 1707, fecha en la que se firmó el Acta de Unión con Inglaterra para crear el Reino de Gran Bretaña, aunque Escocia ha mantenido cierto sistema legal propio, reconocido incluso en el derecho internacional. Un ejemplo de este estatus diferencial es, por ejemplo, el sistema educativo diferente al inglés. Cuenta con un estatus curricular para niños de entre 3 y 5 años. En Escocia hay 14 universidades.
Hace, 60 años los escoceses han sostenido el Partido Conservador más que el Partido Laborista. Lo que tenemos, me parece, es una sociedad algo más, que es probablemente un censo de una comunidad y de una valorización positiva de la idea de la comunidad, del común. Este no implica que tenemos una sociedad de la izquierda, porque el Partido Laborista me parece ser una fuerza bastante conservadora en la sociedad escocesa. Y es interesante que el éxito del Partido Nacionalista es de ocupar el espacio a la izquierda de los socialistas. Es interesante. A este momento ocupan este espacio. No absolutamente, pero hay un programa de justicia social, etcétera, que es muy atractivo a este momento, dado la comparación con lo que pasa en Inglaterra, sobre todo.
I think it's a real mix. It's lots of factors. It's what happens in our schools, what happens in our churches, what happens in civic society. The fact that we've still got a separate church up here, we've still got a separate legal system up here. But I think the real nub of it is that after 300 years of the Union, Scotland's clear sense of identity is a function of successive generations of grandmothers taking children, sitting them on their knees and telling these children who they are in words, in stories, in songs, in poetry. We are who we are, we're Scots, we're proud of it, no better than any other nation, but able to play a part in the diversity of the planet. And the last thing we ever want to see is any blending of Scotland into the point that we lose that identity. We're open to many influences from outside, but this unique Scottish voice, same as a unique Basque voice, same as a unique Catalan voice, is what makes this planet diverse and successful.
The question about Scotland being more progressive than other parts of the UK is really interesting, because it's a bit of a political construction. You're never quite sure whether it's true. But what's curious is that politicians and the public pick this kind of thing up. That they can say, the main parties in Scotland can say Scotland's more progressive, and voters buy into that and accept it. Now, you can unpack that in policy terms now and say, yeah, hold on a minute, university education in Scotland is free for people who live here. In England, it's now charging for it. it's not just the idea that there's the myth that Scotland's more progressive. You can pin it down to some policy decisions and some things that are quite different too. But you are looking at a bit of nation building around Scotland, and people who want to nation build about Scotland and ideology want to make it more different from England. But then lots of voters accept that. I guess it's one of those key things the Yes campaign will try and say this is a different country with different values and a bit of a different view on ideology, and try and hitch Scotland to Scandinavia more, into progressive values there, and the idea of a more social democratic society. That's how they'll try and frame independence rather than just viewing it in UK terms. But when you pick those countries as positives, they tell you something about the rest of the UK that they hope voters will recognise and think is positive.
La demanda de la creación de una asamblea escocesa fue iniciada en 1853. Tras la Primera Guerra Mundial, se fundó en 1921 la Liga Nacional Escocesa, una organización que luchó por la independencia de Escocia con influencia del Sinn Féin irlandés. Creó el periódico Scots Independent en 1926 y en 1928 colaboraron con la Asociación Nacionalista Escocesa de la Universidad de Glasgow para crear el Partido Nacional de Escocia. En 1934 se formó el Partido Nacional Escocés, el Scottish National Party. El SNP tuvo un notable éxito electoral en la década de 1960. En mayo de 1999, Escocia tuvo sus primeras elecciones para el Parlamento devuelto, y en julio de aquel año, el Parlamento escocés celebró su primera sesión.
The conflict is really interesting because it doesn't really look like a conflict at all when you compare it with other places. It's kind of a conflict of mandates and legitimacy of different governments, and that means it's very institutional. It's not there's not a mass movement of people agitating and complaining about being oppressed, because Scots aren't oppressed by the rest of the UK. It just doesn't really work that way at all. What's interesting in some ways is the emerging differences between Scotland and England, which is a version of what's usually called the North-South divide in Britain, where there's economic differences and also ideological differences between parts of the country. Scotland's really a bit of an example of that. So when nationalists talk about Scotland, they'll talk about having different values from England, being more centre-left, being more community-oriented, and have a different set of values from England. They don't mean all of England, they mean really the southeast, the richest parts. And that kind of plays into the issues around the conflict themselves, because they're about things about social justice, or about the way in which government operates and how it taxes and how it spends money, and etc., etc. So they seem the normal stuff of politics, if you like, not anything specific that you think are incredibly nationalistic. It's not questions about language or identity or culture directly.
There is quite a bit of tension. I mean, there's 4 different nations with different priorities. In fact, within England, there's quite a bit of diversity between the southwest and the northeast. There's a big difference across the UK, but that's what's great about the United Kingdom, is that we are so diverse, but that we live together, even though we are diverse. So there is a conflict, there is a tension, but it's quite healthy.
El SNP ganó con mayoría absoluta las elecciones regionales de mayo de 2011, obteniendo 69 del total de 129 diputados. Junto al Partido Nacional Escocés, apoyan la independencia escocesa Solidaridad, el Partido Verde Escocés, con 2 diputados, y el Partido Socialista Escocés. Las secciones de los 3 grandes partidos lealistas británicos, laborista, conservador y liberal, suman 57 escaños.
By making the case, by being positive, by being aspirational, by being very competent in government. And I think one of the secrets of that competence was that we're a political party that's 79 years old, but was 74 years in opposition. So we were busy people who ran real lives, who held real jobs, who built businesses, etc., and who had to handle politics efficiently in our spare time. And I think we've been a breath of fresh air to the people of Scotland and to the civil service in terms of being very competent people who could work hard in a useful direction. And I think that national dialogue has been very useful. We had the national conversation. My own version of it, around 191 events where we brought people in the room and essentially asked them what they thought and put it up on a mind map real time to get engagement. I think people begin in that kind of climate to see the huge assets that we have in Scotland, the natural resources, the skilled people, our academia, our built environment, the great strong sectors of our economy, whether that's energy or financial services or food and drink, etc. And see that the optimisation of Scotland has to be carried out in a way that the benefit accrues to the people of Scotland and the benefit doesn't go elsewhere, as has happened in the past.
Because it's very early. At the moment, I think the public are just getting the idea in their head that there's going to be a referendum and they want lots of issues that they need to think about. So they've got the idea that this is going to come. There's eagerness among some, certainly to be independent, but it's not that mass phenomenon yet. But that's why it's a bit of a long campaign in thinking, okay, it's relatively quiet now, but as it gets nearer, lots of issues, there'll be lots of engagement and lots of issues that people start to deal with and try and find answers to. So in that, from that point of view, the 2.5-year timescale is probably quite good. What you didn't want to do if you're having a referendum on something this big was have a quick 2 months or 6 weeks kind of campaign. That probably wouldn't do anybody any good. You really need time for people to let it sink in that this is happening, and to let them think about what the future might be like and which one they want, because they've got a menu of choices here. They might have the independence choice or the stay in the UK choice, and the stay in the UK choice is what kind of UK choice too. And they might have a choice about how devolution changes and has more power.
Of course, it has to be respected, and that's why it's important that we have a vigorous debate, that people understand what the consequences of any decision would be, either to stay in the United Kingdom or to leave the United Kingdom. That's what we've got to decide. But of course, it's up to the people to make sure that they are confident that they know exactly what is being proposed and what they're voting for.
Tras haber perdido el tren de una eventual reforma constitucional que hubiera podido servir para acomodar las diferentes realidades nacionales que conforman el actual Reino Unido, lo que finalmente queda por delimitar es la confrontación entre dos proyectos, el unionista y el nacionalista escocés.
A este momento en Gran Bretaña tenemos un proyecto de reformar el House of Lords, la Casa de los Lords, la segunda cámara del Parlamento, con una clase política inteligente sería una oportunidad crear un elemento federal en nuestra constitución. Pero no me parece que llegamos a este punto. Y es una cosa muy extraña porque los liberales que ocupan parte del gobierno a Londres han tenido desde decenios un proyecto de federalismo, pero dado la oportunidad de proseguirla, no han tomado. Es muy extraño. Este puede ser un modo de reconocer la realidad de la diversidad de los nacionalismos en Gran Bretaña y quizá de producir un modelo positivo para reinventar la vida política. Pero no me parece que llegamos a este punto. Más probable sería una confrontación entre el proyecto de los unionistas y el proyecto de los nacionalistas.
Independence is interesting as a time scale. I mean, at the moment we're going to have a referendum in 2.5 years' time. The referendum, if it's yes, will not mean the next day Scotland becomes independent, the flags fly and everybody cheers. Then there'll be what's called a transition period, where Scotland will negotiate with the rest of the UK and with other international institutions what's going to happen. And with the UK, some things will be about the budget, the currency, the national debt, all sorts of things and transitional arrangements. And with the European Union, it will be about membership. And it's a funny area, it's a difficult area because, well, we're already members of the European Union as the UK, but not as Scotland. And I don't know how the European Union deals with that. It's not as if they have a procedure ready in order to deal with that scenario, but it's likely to be a scenario they have to deal with and make a political decision about whether Scotland is in or out. But it's a really funny scenario because we've all got European Union passports. That's the version, the wonderful purple passport everyone has. Lots of the European legislation exists in Scotland. So it's a really funny scenario to eject Scotland, given that it's more prepared and has all the stuff in place than any of the other countries that might be joining as future members. So it's a really, you know, it's a negotiation problem, if you like, and it's not obvious what the answer is, but it's a really curious one. You know, if the European Union is going to eject a member who actually wants to join. It's a really strange scenario for them to have to deal with, given that the history of the European Union has been one that grows and adds member states. Next up, Croatia, after that, Serbia, in between, maybe Scotland, maybe not, we don't really know, but that's the direction Europe's moving.
I think it's always useful to learn from other people's politics. The mistake that often people make is to automatically translate what happens in one country to what happens in another. But what's quite interesting about independence is that there's no single country, modern country, with a developed welfare state that's been part of the global economy, that's decided to break up. It's all ex-communist countries, it's all countries that have been riven by war and famine. So that's what, and there is a reason for that, and it's because it's quite a difficult thing to do. Breaking up complex nations is a difficult thing. And I think that's a lesson for everybody, no matter where they are in the world, that, you know, it's okay to be small, but it's not normal to break up a country in order to become small. And that's what is really important, that everybody throughout the world observes and engages and takes back to their own politics.
Desde 20 años o más hay un discurso de Escocia en Europa, una Escocia independiente en Europa. Los nacionalistas creo tienen la idea que sería muy fácil negociar una entrada en la Unión Europea después de la ruptura con el Estado británico. Bueno, según las opiniones de juristas, probablemente no es tan sencillo, pero imagino que la entrada de Escocia no sería necesariamente rechazada. Pero hay un aspecto que sería muy bien conocido en España, que es el efecto de copiar cada suceso de este tipo de política y naturalmente implica mucho para el Estado español como para el Estado británico. Me parece que en Escocia no hay evidencia de actitudes más positivas hacia Europa que en el resto de Gran Bretaña. No hay ninguna evidencia de este tipo de distinción entre, por ejemplo, Escocia e Inglaterra. No diría que estamos todos escépticos, porque este es un modo de reducir la complicación de las relaciones entre esas islas y el continente demasiado, pero no hay ninguna evidencia otro que el desear del Partido Nacionalista que los escoceses quieren entrar en Europa.
Pero al margen de un eventual futuro europeísta, o bien si finalmente se mantiene el conocido escepticismo en relación con la Unión por parte de Escocia, no cabe duda de que el proceso iniciado en esta pequeña nación puede servir como referente en un contexto de crisis económica y financiera de los grandes estados europeos y, sobre todo, frente a una realidad que ha puesto blanco sobre negro la dictadura de los mercados y, por lo tanto, las carencias en políticas sociales.
There's something called a demonstration effect. So when something happens in one country, other countries can somehow take note of it. Particularly the politicians, the political parties will say, look at Scotland, look at what they've done, can we do that? And in the UK, the devolutions feed off each other because they have different powers. And one of the things in the last 10 years has been watching devolution in Wales become more like Scotland, because they can see, Scotland has these powers and this level of autonomy, and they can do these policy decisions, we'd like to do them too. So you kind of have that relationship within the UK already, but you'll have it in other parts of Europe too. But it doesn't necessarily mean that other nations and regions will become independent. Politicians will talk about it and make parallels, but it doesn't mean anything actually will happen.
I mean, our priorities will be to set out the positive case for the United Kingdom, why it's better to be part of a United Kingdom family that's been together for 300 years, that shares risk and it shares rewards. So when times are tough, we rally round. When things are good, we share the rewards. That's what the United Kingdom is for us. But we'll also be setting out what's good about home rule, so that a Scottish Parliament that's bigger, it's more powerful, that can determine our own destiny on the domestic agenda while still being part of the United Kingdom. That will be our priorities, and we'll be going around the country selling that message.
How is it going to be financed? How many people are going to really be involved in it? Those are all sorts of questions. We can answer those for the Yes campaign because we know. For the No campaign, we don't know. We don't know who's doing it, and we certainly don't know where the money's coming from. And the money and where it comes from is politically a very charged question. And then thinking, who's going to fund the No campaign? Is it going to be funded here in Scotland or somewhere else? And there's a problem issue to start with that the No campaign will have to deal with. And I don't know, I have no insight at this stage how that's going to work.
I think that will play a big part. I think it's about getting the votes of everybody in Scotland. And I think the key thing is that we've got to overcome the fear, uncertainty and doubt that our opponents will put forward. There's a lot of studies being done into how that works. You can demand the need. You can demand more and more detail. You can call for delaying tactics. You can even doubt the character of the people who are putting ideas forward. We've got to confront all that and look at this positive that comes from running your own affairs, and essentially get people to look back at their own situation. If I, as a father, was to insist that my son and daughter lived next door to me, pay their salaries into my bank account, and I cleared all their big bills and gave them an allowance to manage their private and social life, that would diminish them as people. The deal that we've got with the UK just now has diminished Scotland from its potential. And the more we have that argument, the more we have that debate, the more people understand that, the more we'll get the support we need. Well, I think that's just a self-evident truth, but especially now, because we've got some small countries that have been very, very shrewd and played it well and survived well, like the Norwegians. But Scotland and the Basque Country and Catalonia and in Flanders and Quebec, we've now all got the benefit of learning the mistakes that small countries made as well. So the mistakes of Iceland, the mistakes of Ireland, are things that we can weave into the strength of our proposition, and have this improved feedback loop that you have in a small country. People in a small country are able to know when things are going wrong, are able to know when people are abusing the system, etc. And that's what we seek to have, and to play a real part in creating yet more small, vibrant countries.